welcome to meeting number 34 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. The committee is meeting today to continue our review on the House of Commons virtual hybrid proceedings provisions pursuant to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022.
And media witnesses. Our second panel consists of experts knowledgeable on issues of auditory health and injuries. I would like to let the committee know that all our virtual witnesses have all undergone their pre-meeting connectivity and audio tests. We're welcoming today from Equal Voice, Eleanor Fast, Executive Director, Maggie Patterson, Director of Programs with Equal Voice, Honest Talks, Catherine Clark, co-founder, and Jennifer Stewart, co-founder. And we have from Samara Center for Democracy, Sabrina Dallin, Executive Director, and is joining us by video conference today. And so I'll just remind, I know that there's different people speaking and there's combinations and individuals, so we're excited. We will time you. I try not to cut you off, but I will because time is very limited. So if you can just help me help you, that would be great. I would also just ask that comments all be made through the chair. And I know sometimes we like to speak directly to each other. I get that. But as long as we're maintaining decorum, I'm good with it. Otherwise, I will be the chair. And the last thing, interpretation. If we can just speak in a way that the interpreters can do their work, because both of the official languages are very active in this committee. Okay, perfect. With that, I'll pass it over to Equal Voice. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for inviting Equal Voice here today. Equal Voice is a nonprofit, multi-partisan organization dedicated to electing more women to all levels of government in Canada. For over 20 years, Equal Voice has been advocating for gender parity by working with political parties to equip women for success in politics and to retain women as elected officials. 2021 was the 100th anniversary of the election of the first woman MP, yet still only 30% of MPs are women, and Canada has yet to elect an openly non-binary MP. Part of increasing the diversity of MPs is making Parliament a more inclusive and accessible workplace. We recommend Parliament continues to offer hybrid participation. I will briefly describe 2 areas of evidence to support our recommendation. More information on these studies is in our brief to the committee. Firstly, our research shows that hybrid proceedings support gender-inclusive legislatures. In February 2020, after 3 years of research, Equal Voice launched a report with 10 recommendations that federal, provincial, and territorial legislatures could take in order to make them better places for women and gender-diverse people to work. A major finding was that legislatures need to modernize. Modernization includes remote participation for MPs who cannot or should not travel to Ottawa due to illness, pregnancy, caregiving, or other circumstances. Secondly, our research shows that hybrid proceedings have the potential to attract more women to politics. Equal Voice commissioned a public opinion survey published in January 2022 to better understand views on politics. It was found that 86% of the public, of all genders, said that we need more women as elected representatives in Canada. And 85% of respondents said that having more women in politics would have a positive impact on government policy, actions, and decisions. Canadians want more women in politics. We also surveyed 1,500 young women from the general public about their views on politics. 67% of women think being an elected representative is one of the most impactful ways to serve their communities, yet only 39% say politics offers a work-life balance. And 81% of women feel that running for office would be difficult to manage with other responsibilities in their life. In addition, Equal Voice regularly meets with women and gender-diverse people from all political backgrounds across Canada. We consistently see women choosing to run at the municipal level, often to be able to stay physically close to their families and communities. This is in contrast to the exceedingly long travel times for some MPs. From our discussions, we have strong reason to believe that more women will seek federal office if hybrid participation is available. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to give these opening remarks. We look forward to the committee's questions.
Much for those opening remarks and using your time so good. So thank you. That was really well done. I will now pass it over to Honest Talk. Welcome.
Alors, bonjour, Madame la Présidente.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Vice Chairs, and members of the committee. My colleague Jennifer Stewart and I are pleased to be here with you to give us our views about a hybrid parliamentary structure.
Be sharing our time, but we are also the co-founders of The Honest Talk, which is a podcast aimed at telling the stories of female leaders across Canada from a variety of spheres of influence. We are also mothers and communications entrepreneurs. We're delighted to be here with all of you today. We'd like to begin by underlining our belief that continuing to embrace a hybrid approach for the House of Commons is not a partisan issue. Rather, it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity to attract to public service more women, more people from diverse backgrounds, and more individuals from various regions of the country. And that can only strengthen democracy. We all know that our governance structures are enhanced by diversity. We know that more voices in a room, voices representing different lived experiences, lead to overall stronger outcomes, whether that room is a boardroom, a classroom, a committee room, or the seat of our Canadian democracy, the House of Commons. But up until the past 2 years, our governance structures have functioned on a one-size-fits-all approach, in person or nothing. And that approach, in our opinion, is the enemy of diversity. And that is why we are firmly in support of a hybrid House of Commons. It is 2022. We live in an age which puts a paramount and justified focus on fostering and ensuring diversity, equity, and inclusion. And given that, why would we not strive to make our seat of democracy the most accessible, equitable place that it can be? Au cours des 31 derniers mois, nous avons
Over the past 30 months, we've seen businesses, organizations, and governments propelled into a new way of doing things that would have been unimaginable before COVID-19. Most went entirely virtual and successfully made that transition. And then they went hybrid because that's what their modern workforce required.
Why should members of Parliament always be required to fly to Ottawa to partake? Well, they could fly, take the train, or drive to Ottawa to partake in parliamentary business. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it is that doing things one way, because that's how we've always done it, is neither efficient nor reflective of our new reality.
The House of Commons did extraordinary work to adapt to health regulations put in place due to the pandemic. It took a lot of study, consultation, and effort to shift policies that had not seen much procedural change since Confederation. It also took major investment in technology to ensure that members were able to participate safely in conversations and effectively represent their constituencies. With all of this learning and technology now in place, with the money spent, why would our federally elected officials take a step back? Instead, our parliamentarians have an opportunity to continue to demonstrate leadership from the top and to create a truly 21st century House of Commons. We have an opportunity not to just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion at the highest levels, but to make it a reality. Of course, there will be roadblocks and learning experiences. Equal access to broadband internet is not assured in many communities, especially those which are rural or remote. Cybersecurity is an ongoing concern that requires serious thought and attention. And a member of Parliament participating remotely must be assured the same access and opportunity as someone in person. But we are at a critical moment in time. We can learn from the past turbulent 31 months and continue to adopt new technologies and maintain positive change, or we can stagnate. The private and public sectors are embracing the flexibility of a hybrid structure because, to put it bluntly, it is the new path forward. It's time for our elected officials to get on board and to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Samara Centre for Democracy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to speak with the committee today. My name is Sabrina Dellin, and I'm the Executive Director of the Samara Centre for Democracy, which is a nonpartisan registered charity dedicated to making Canada's democratic culture more accessible, responsive, and inclusive. We've also been studying the lived experience of elected officials for 15 years. Our recommendation is that the House of Commons maintain hybrid proceedings for both the House and its committees. This recommendation is informed by our MP Exit interview project, which entails conducting in-depth, rigorous interviews with former members of Parliament. Our view is also informed by recent research on hybrid workspaces within the future of work discourse. We advise on maintaining hybridity for 3 reasons. It offers Parliament an opportunity to be more inclusive and representative, as my colleagues have indicated, also to function as a flexible and contemporary workplace that can attract and retain top talent, and also to increase efficiency by saving money and travel time. Our conclusion is shaped by the underrepresentation of various groups in the House, including women, along with those in the LGBTQ+, Indigenous and visible minority communities. Our interviews with former MPs over the years have underscored the grinding schedule of weekly travel to and from Ottawa, particularly from regions situated far from Ontario, can create a barrier for women with families, particularly for women who lack abundant resources to put towards childcare. This aligns with findings of the Interparliamentary Union, which currently ranks Canada 61st in terms of gender representation among national parliaments. They recommend that gender-sensitive parliaments allow teleworking as a strategy to increase equity. While there was initial concern that gender representation would be compromised with limited in-person convening, innovations in the function of hybrid parliament have made it possible for virtual work to increase democratic representation across genders. Our research also indicates that MPs from underrepresented groups often feel alienated in Ottawa. We believe that if representatives have more opportunity to work from and within their communities, it will reduce that sense of alienation that they may experience in the House. And there's also the longer-term effect of encouraging MPs from underrepresented groups to not only enter into politics, but also to stay. The retention of MPs from underrepresented groups is worth noting. If the House wants to attract and retain high-quality individuals with varied training and innovative problem-solving abilities, it will need to be responsive to larger changes happening in Canada's new world of work. Hybrid work options are an indicator of a modern employer, and workplaces across sectors are institutionalizing the option. Research shows that people who have worked in a hybrid environment over the past 2 years strongly wish to retain the option going forward. This is particularly true for those with disabilities, women of color, and LGBTQ+ individuals. Institutionalizing hybrid proceedings for the House and its committees is a key way to demonstrate that Parliament is a responsive, contemporary work environment that is committed to attracting, retaining, and supporting top talent. The Samara Centre has long held the position that the House should foster a workplace culture that facilitates collegiality and informal relationship building. We believe that this can be accomplished through a combination of virtual and in-person interactions. Our survey of MPs in 2020 found strong support for a hybrid model of Parliament. This is readily within reach to set as a standard practice now that our use of virtual technologies has evolved and become commonplace, adaptable, effective, and user-friendly. Beyond equity, hybrid proceedings offer incredible efficiencies. The transit time recovered each week for MPs that live in ridings located far from Ottawa is significant. Our research has consistently revealed the mental and physical toll that constant travel can take on MPs. Making hybrid proceedings permanent opens up considerably more time for constituency work while protecting the health and well-being of MPs.
Thank you so much for those opening comments. We look forward to learning more during the question and answer sessions. And so with thank you. With that, we will start with our 6-minute round. We'll be commencing with Mr. Nader, followed by Mrs. Sahota, puis Madame Goudreau, et puis Madame Blaney. Mr. Nader, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our panel of witnesses this morning. It was quite an interesting commentary, and I'm going to try to jump around to all 3 sets of witnesses. I'm sure Madam Chair will give me lots of flexibility with my time. I'll start with online, and I'll start with Samara, who in my past life I had a great privilege of reading through the transcripts from some of the from a large amount of the MP exit interviews, which I found absolutely fascinating for some research I was doing at the time. But one of the things that struck me about the MP exit interviews was the focus that a lot of the MPs placed on the informal aspects of Parliament, the unofficial encounters, the hallway conversations, the coffee in the cafeteria. Yesterday in the House, we heard some wonderful tributes to the late Bill Blakey, and the leader of the NDP talked about the Robbie Burns nights on the Hill, where MPs could get together outside of the daily debate. And I guess my question is, what challenges do you see about a shift to virtual, where these kinds of informal interactions, these informal encounters, events, activities that typically take place within the precinct, when people aren't able to have those interactions?
This challenge is not unique to Parliament. It's something that a lot of different workplaces are struggling with right now. And our recommendation is the creation of an inclusive hybrid workplace that's agile and responsive. So that entails getting feedback from parliamentarians about what is and isn't working. And we also advise on being particularly intentional about those in-person interactions, so that you have those collision spaces, you have those informal opportunities to just be human beings together over a coffee. Making these opportunities meaningful and productive will ensure that the hybrid culture is not only functional, but that it's also thriving. And so hybrid is not just all virtual all the time. It's really important for us to understand that. It's about making better use of the in-person time when it is available.
Thank you for that. And I may come back to that second point, but one of the challenges I've seen over the past couple of years since we've gone virtual is civility within the House of Commons itself. I've actually seen a marked decrease in civility and increase in incivility, partially I believe because some MPs don't see each other face to face. Do you agree with that, or have you observed that as well, the incivility that's increased since virtual Parliament has begun?
Yeah, we track toxicity in the online conversation through a project called Sambot, where we use AI to monitor this. And I don't think that it's an increase in number of hours spent in the same room together that can mitigate the increase in toxicity in the political conversation. It's about having a set of standards, an established code of conduct, culture that will make the difference. And again, it's about using that in-person time with clear intentions and expectations of how conduct will unfold, and creating opportunities for civility to become the norm in a way that is aligned with the future of work in Canada.
Thank you for that. I'm now going to turn to our guests in the room, and I've about 3 minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll say a couple questions and invite both sets of panelists to respond in an efficient use of my time, Madam Chair. First of all, it was mentioned in Ms. Patterson's opening comments about some of the considerations of when virtual Parliament would be an option. What struck me was that you made the comment of family responsibilities, caregiving, illness. Very much, I think, common sense ones. What you didn't mention were partisan considerations, partisan events. So I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I will ask the question of whether or not you see this as an option for partisan-related options as well. And that would be a question that both sets of so political events and ridings, events or in other people's ridings across the country, where one could take advantage of that. So that's the first question. I'll allow both groups to respond. But my second question as well is the involvement of the whip. I say this cognizant that the whip's sitting, or the former whip sitting two people over from me, but certainly there's always those unintended consequences. So I would offer any input you may have on the inadvertent challenges we may have by giving the whip, for example, increased power, increased authority, whether formal or informal, over the activities of parliamentarians related to virtual Parliament. So giving the whip the authority to say when a member may or may not be virtual, or when a member may or may not be in their ridings or in another person's riding, what unintended consequences and how we may be able to mitigate that. So I'll put those questions out there, and maybe we'll start with equal voice and then move to our second set of panelists.
And you have a minute combined to answer.
I went as fast as I could, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for the question. just to focus on your first question as to when hybrid should be used, our recommendation at Equal Voice is very much focused on hybrid participation when people are either should not or cannot travel to the house. So for reasons related to illness, pregnancy, caregiving responsibilities, as you noted. I think beyond that, this is why the work of the committee is so important, and obviously your colleagues and the parties and so on to think about those questions about beyond times when you actually can't come, when perhaps it's appropriate not to come.
Thank you for the question. I think it's incredibly important that we don't politicize hybrid parliament, that this provides flexibility for women and men to come to Parliament when it works for their professional and personal schedules, and when it absolutely does not, have the ability to participate in a hybrid environment. I'm a business owner. I prefer being in a working environment, but certainly as a mother, there are times I need to be home with a sick child or to balance an appointment or the priorities that life throws my way. So I think it's truly about flexibility. It's not black and white. There are many shades of gray to how hybrid should be implemented. Thank you.
And I'll pass it now over to Mrs. Sahota, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What we've been hearing quite a bit at our last committee meeting is pretty much an all or nothing type of mentality with some of the questions that we're hearing. And so I found it very interesting, Ms. Clark, when you had mentioned that, this is not an in-person or nothing type approach. We also heard quite a lot about how we will be giving away some of the benefits that in-person proceedings provide to a healthy democracy and a functioning parliament. So I was wondering if I could get some comments from all three groups that are here present today about how we could make it work within the gray and how we can approach this in a systematic and professional, responsible way without damaging our democracy. If I could hear from Equal Voice first, please.
Thank you so much for the question. One of the important things, I think, about hybrid participation is that it actually allows people to continue to work at times when otherwise they might not be able to. So before we had this option, if people were too ill or unable to come to the house, of course, they weren't able to participate in the work of the House and, being on the committee or so on, whereas obviously hybrid proceedings give people an opportunity to do that. And so I don't think it's a question of in-person versus virtual participation. It really is taking advantage of the opportunities that the technology provides us with. And as we outlined in our opening remarks, we believe, and we have research to show that people are more likely to enter politics and want to be part of the system if they have the opportunity, or they know that hybrid will be there for them at times when they need it. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Clark.
If I may, I think we need to adopt a 30,000-foot perspective on this. It is unfortunate to miss an event with colleagues. I appreciate that business can occur at those events or key relationships can be built. But we're talking about leveraging the past 31 months, leveraging learning opportunities, and modernizing and innovating a process that desperately needs to be innovated to attract and retain the brightest to serve as parliamentarians. Thank you.
Ms. Dillon?
Oh, thank you. So perhaps with the exception of select circumstances, we recommend that remote participation be available for all MPs at any time. And this is to mitigate the liabilities of in-group versus out-group dynamics developing. And I think it's important for us to think about the way we live in the context of how we work. There are a lot of virtual forms of connection and communication that we engage in. Group chats, for instance, by text are ways that a lot of us stayed connected, especially during the worst stages of the pandemic. There are parallels from that we can bring into the world of work, where we can foster meaningful relationships, collegiality, and connection. Just because it's virtual doesn't mean that it's not real. This is an important parallel to the online harms conversation. When we talk about toxicity online, when we qualify it as online, there's a diminishing element to it, as if it isn't real. There's a profound and important way for us to build connection through virtual technologies, through text, through meetings like this, that are extremely valuable and efficient. And another dimension for us to consider here is the incredible cost savings. It's wonderful for people to be able to get together with their colleagues and conduct business and share information and develop relationships. But with a reduction in travel, comes an opportunity to reduce expenses to the public purse, and also an opportunity to redirect resources back to constituents, back to communities. Also, there's the fact that a healthy MP, one whose health and mental health and overall well-being is cared for in a sustainable manner, is going to be a more functional and effective person. MPs are people, and we need to factor that into this design.
One quick follow-up for the witnesses from Honest Talk. We also heard quite a bit about accountability and how if we, stay in this hybrid format, there will be less accountability. And also coming off of what Ms. Dillon said about mental health, we've heard the opposite argument as well, that there should be a complete separation of family and your roles and responsibilities in the constituency versus here in Parliament as a legislature. What would you have to say about that? As a legislator, sorry.
Perhaps I'll start with that last question first. As a person who spent the first 16 years of her life as the child of a federal politician, I can say that it is impossible to separate your personal life and your professional life all of the time. And I just don't think it's reasonable to expect that in 2022 we would ask anyone to try to do so. Everyone is a professional when they come to Ottawa, but life does intervene. The point of a hybrid parliament is to allow the kind of flexibility that ensures that the House of Commons becomes a modern workplace, that it is the kind of workplace that people want to join. And the reason they want to join is so that we can strengthen democracy. This kind of change is hard. Any challenging change is hard to do, but it is also the right thing to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Goudreau.
Merci. I'd like to thank our witnesses. There have been a lot of questions raised by my colleagues. And Madam Chair, I would like to delve into these questions a bit more. When we talk about accountability, as you know, dear witnesses, the role of the legislator is fulfilled 26. We're here 26 weeks a year, as you know, so we can focus our time differently. How are we, as a government, in terms of accountability and in terms of the, and perhaps my question is for, I'm looking for your name here, Miss Dillon. When it comes to democracy, when journalists can take out aspects when something has happened in front of the camera, they're close by, there's this possibility for an exchange, but virtually it's not the same. I'd like your opinion. How can we maintain a healthy democracy in this context where, and I'm going to say, we can turn off the connection if we want, or you're stuck in front of a camera?
I think that in terms of accountability to the electorate, to the public, it lies in the evolution. If Parliament isn't able to adapt and align with the future of work in Canada with the way the rest of the world is looking to conduct work, there lies a lack of accountability within that reluctance. And it's important for us to remember that Parliament Hill is not a static institution. It has adapted before to changing needs of the country, to technology. We saw this during the Second World War and with the advent of more affordable air travel. It's that evolution that has the accountability baked into it. And to be certain, in-person interactions are valuable and critical, and we're talking about combining the two. And the alternative here is if we remove virtual completely, it's in person or nothing. This option is about in person and something. And with the increasing normalization and just socialization of how we use technologies like Zoom today, it has become more immediate and human in the way we're able to speak and communicate with each other. We've seen this with our exit interviews with MPs. This is the first time we've done, over the last few months, we're working on our third iteration of the study. All of our interviews have been on Zoom, and we take care to establish rapport and an atmosphere that enables our respondent to feel comfortable being forthcoming, sharing their lived experiences with us. There are ways for us to draw from that in professional contexts.
Je vous remercie. Justement, vous amenez un...
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to know more about the following. When we host an event, we're all there. We abide by procedures. We try to establish a constructive ambiance. Ms. Clark, through you, Madam Chair, you talked about guaranteeing inclusion. Right out the outset, when I'm sick, I'm sick. So I look after my health first. I don't want to be told I have to go to work if I'm sick. But that being said, how do we manage to include people when informal exchanges are done within the cocktails I had at the cocktail party at the University of Quebec, or exchanges after with a witness after they give testimony? How should I decide whether to work at home? I'm going to miss out on that. So I hear there are a lot of advantages. But how do you deal with the drawbacks? Because inclusion can't be respected in that case. Thank you for your question. And I think that it's essential to keep this type of exchange. We're not talking about a situation where we're suggesting an event either in person or virtual. We're proposing a hybrid format. And I know that there will be some occasions where, as a legislator, you'll be missing out on some personal conversations. But it's important to be flexible. We have to create a modern workplace where people work. So you do agree, Madam Chair, that there is a distinction between what can be done here in committee and what can be done at the House of Commons and what can be done. I confess I have virtual meetings with the people in my riding. But that being said, I'm really focusing on the role of the legislator. The 26 weeks where every whip, every party has to juggle with attending members for votes. I'm not against technology. We have seen real successes here. But I would like you to tell me more about how we could, if we had very specific parameters, how do we make these decisions very, very quickly? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think when you talked about the successes that we've seen with hybrid parliament in the last 2 years, and that's obviously COVID was really terrible, but Equal Voice has been advocating for some kind of remote participation for several years before COVID, and we were always told absolutely not possible. It's tradition. You have to be in the house. COVID has made it happen, and I think we've got this wonderful opportunity to build on the technological advances of COVID to see that successes carried forward.
Thank you. Madame Blaney, 6 minutes.
Madam Blaney, 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and I thank all the witnesses for being here today. I found it incredibly interesting. And it really brought to mind a day that I spent in the riding with a woman who invited me to spend the day with her. Her name Karen, who lives her life in a wheelchair. And so she put me in one too, and we rolled around a small part of one of the communities I represent. First of all, I have muscles in my arms and my shoulders that I didn't even know existed until that day. But what was really powerful about that was just looking at all the small things that really excluded her. And one of the things she sent me home to always carry with me is that when you make things accessible, it's better for everyone, regardless of if you're able-bodied or not. And that really hit home for me, is that everything that we can do as human beings to make life more accessible just opens doors that we may not know are closed. So, you know, we've heard things today here about the importance of relationship building, the challenges that can be provided if you're not together. And I really appreciate what people are saying. This is not all or nothing. This is about creating a way to include people that might be excluded because of things beyond their control. So I'm going to ask all three of you, if I can start with Ms. Dillon first, to just talk about how is this going to open doors? What are codes of conduct or practices that we can do that will create opportunities for relationships? Because I keep hearing sort of this blockage to relationship instead of how can we explore how to build relationship, even if people participate sometimes virtually. And I just want to recognize that two things for myself is most of our members are sitting in the House. I mean, people look at the camera every day, you see people. The majority of our members are already here from every party. And the other thing is that I actually found virtual parliament, when we were totally in virtual parliament, the decorum went up in some ways, because if you were yelling at someone, you had to turn on your mic and your picture was in front. So there isn't the same mentality as when you're in a group yelling. So I just want to acknowledge those two things and just ask specifically around, do you have recommendations about how we can make relationships if we're virtual, and how do we include people, and how will this make it accessible? And if I could start with you, Ms. Dillon.
Thank you. I think that's an important observation, that the performative aspect is really diminished when people are joining from home or from a different location, when you're joining through a remote context. You're really more focused on the task, and you are bringing a form of yourself that is not tied to looking a certain way, sounding a certain way, and participating by default in perhaps an adversarial type of manner. It's just really harder to do that performative approach when you're on your own in an office, for instance. And I think that there's a real opportunity to increase relevance, responsiveness, and demonstrate evolution here, and showcase Parliament as a modern contemporary democracy by drawing on technologies, testing, seeing what works, as I mentioned. Do a pulse check. What is and isn't working for MPs? There are a range of different tools available to communicate. It's not just virtual meetings. There are instant messaging platforms that you can use for this. We have seen an increasing number of companies, nonprofit organizations, universities, and other entities draw on technologies like Zoom, Google Meet, Slack, other project management types of softwares. These are not expensive tools, and they are worthy of testing. And again, bringing that intentionality to the in-person opportunities is really key. And it's also important from a democratic perspective to offer the choice. That is the dominant theme in the future of work discourse right now. If we're looking to bring the best and the brightest to lead us in our democracy, it is a non-starter that there be a hybrid option to the conditions of work. And it's really important for us to consider that in terms of relevance, evolution, and modernization, and efficiency as well.
Thank you. Honest Talk.
Thank you for the question. I come back to the notion that hybrid parliament is covered by a number of gray areas in the sense that it's not black and white. I very much doubt that parliamentarians will elect to just stay home when they have a duty to serve their country and strengthen their democracy. This is about flexibility. It's about options. It's about being able to work remotely if that's what needs to occur to accommodate your personal obligations or your family obligations. We can look to corporations all across Canada that have modernized their workplaces and have done so very successfully and fiscally positive, in a fiscally positive way, and adopt those models and utilize those best practices. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've had women in the House of Commons for 100 years, and still only 30% of MPs are women. And I think that all of us should be concerned about how to increase representation, and that comes into inclusion and accessibility. And of course, when we talk about those numbers of women with intersectional identities like Black women, Indigenous women, women of color, LGBTQ, and so on, are even less represented. And it is about accessibility to some extent. Statistics Canada tells us that women are twice as likely to take on caregiving responsibilities, even if those women are working full-time outside the home. And so I think this is an issue that can help increase representation in the House.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. We're going to now go for the second round, starting with Mr. Cooper, followed by Mrs. Romanado.
Great. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses for your thoughtful presentations. I'm going to pose my first question to Equal Voice. You had cited some data around work-life balance, and I will challenge that a little bit. And I agree it's very important that we try to strive for work-life balance to the degree that it is possible in a demanding job like that of a member of Parliament. But the reality is that it is tough on families. It is tough on couples. There's no question about that. But at the same time, we sit 26 weeks a year. So nearly half the year we're not sitting in Ottawa. So we can be back at home in our ridings. There are constituency weeks. When we are here, they often are incredibly long days. I mean, I got into the office at 8 a.m. this morning. The House is sitting until 10 p.m. due to a take-note debate. I'm going to be participating in that debate, so I don't expect that I'll be out of here until probably 10 p.m. My constituents appreciate that when I'm here, I'm debating legislation, studying legislation at committee, and when I'm back in the riding, I'm there attending events, meeting with constituents, and of course my staff are there meeting with and helping constituents every single day. So from a work-life balance standpoint, how does it enhance work-life balance given the demands of what happens on a day-to-day basis when the House is sitting, coupled with what will inevitably be the expectation that you're at community events at the same time?
Thank you. And MPs work incredibly hard, and all of us are incredibly grateful for the service that you all give to the community and the country. And certainly the recommendations that Equal Voice is making, we think benefit everybody, men and women. From the surveys that we've done, we found that 81% of women feel that running for office would be difficult to manage with other responsibilities in their life. And I'm sure we did not survey men as well, so I don't have the comparable number for men, and certainly work-life balance is really important for everyone. And when we think about the benefits for hybrid participation, what we're talking about is people, when they cannot or should not come to Ottawa, that they're able to do that, and yet they're still able to fulfill their responsibilities as MPs in things like voting. So if, for example, someone has a very ill family member that they absolutely need to be with, and yet they are still able, for example, to vote and make that decision, that they can do that, and they're not required to be away from that person.
So, and thank you for that. And as you said earlier, it would be, in limited circumstances that you would contemplate members taking advantage of or using the virtual option as opposed to being here in Ottawa. Am I correct in that? Or do you have any specific ideas around if we were to maintain the hybrid model, are there some limitations that you would recommend? So that members, for example, and I think most members of Parliament try to do their best to be here to represent their constituents, but what do you do with some members who simply don't show up in Ottawa?
I think the full parameters of when hybrid would be used is really a question for, I guess, this committee to make recommendations on, as well as your colleagues and the parties and everything. But we certainly think that those situations should include times like pregnancy, illness, caregiving, and so on.
Okay, my time's expired then.
I really enjoy your generosity. Thank you. Mrs. Romanado.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd like to welcome all the witnesses for being here today, and thank you so much for your expert insight. I want to focus on two things. The first, I want to follow up on Mr. Cooper's comment. In a report, The Remotely Representative House, Lessons Learning from Hybrid Commons by Dr. Jessica Smith and Professor Sarah Childs, in terms of what do you do with a member of Parliament who decides to only participate virtually? Would you agree with the statement, and I quote, "As is now, the electorate will decide whether they are well represented by their MP's way of working." Would you agree with that statement?
I believe we live in a democracy, and that the electorate is intelligent, and that if their member of Parliament is not doing their job, that they will know it, and that person will swiftly learn the will of the people.
Thank you very much. And on that note, I'm glad we're talking about the opportunity to reform the way we do what we do. And we've been talking a lot about flexibility. And I want to thank you for that, Ms. Stewart, for bringing that up, because we're talking about hybrid parliament, which is a blend of virtual and in-person. And we seem to be talking always about these two extremes. What we're talking about here is life happens. If something were to happen and you have to be in your riding, the daycare calls, the child's sick, that you can't go to, there's no one else can watch the child. You need to be there. Things happen in life. And Ms. Clark, you mentioned something as the daughter of a parliamentarian. We've heard from other parliamentarians, we've heard from other witnesses, but we haven't heard from a family member of a parliamentarian. In your expert opinion, having lived through this, would you recommend hybrid parliament in terms of assisting parliamentarians and their families on being able to still continue to do what we need to do in both parts of our lives?
Yes, in fact, not only do I recommend a hybrid parliament in terms of assisting families, but I also believe that it assists the electorate. I believe that having a member of parliament who is able to represent their people, the people of their constituency, either from home, if in fact they cannot for some reason make it to Ottawa, or from Ottawa, allows them the best of both worlds. And in fact, that is what a hybrid system is about. It is not about never showing up in the House of Commons. It is about allowing people to have the flexibility to do their jobs to the very best of their abilities.
I'm not sure if Equal Voice or if Samara wants to jump in on that as well.
I think it's, if I may, important to understand that the virtual option is not a means to shirk your duties. In our considerable interviews with former MPs, the commitment and dedication to public service is paramount. It rings true across all of our respondents. However, we have seen a level of frustration with the lack of standardization in administrative and operational processes in the House, and a sense of shock and surprise, particularly from those in the field of business or other entrepreneurial areas, about why cost-effective modern tools to organize calendars and schedules are not being better utilized in this space. So there's a real opportunity here to increase the contributions from MPs to see to their mental health and well-being and to foster new norms for cohesion, collegiality, and connection amongst MPs and their colleagues.
Thank you very much. And Equal Voice, would you like to jump in? If not, I have another question.
I agree with what's been said, and please, your other question would be great.
Wonderful. So in terms of hybrid, we have extended the motion for hybrid parliament until June 2023. Every member of PROC is sitting here today. We have the option right now, and yet it's not all anarchy. We're not all on a screen right now. We're here with you, and we're able to hear from witnesses who are participating virtually today because we have the technology. Do you feel that this committee would turn into pure anarchy because all of a sudden we allow for hybrid when we already have that in place?
I do not. I think it's extremely important to remember that people that seek to serve their country are doing so altruistically, and they want to serve their constituency. However, as a businesswoman, I have taken calls from the hallways of CHIO before. I'm still able to conduct my business, and I'm still also able to attend to a family emergency. And I think that is really the crux of the issue here today. It's flexibility, and it's ensuring that you modernize and truly create a 21st century House of Commons. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Madame Gaudreau. Demi et demi.
Thank you. At the outset, I'd like to say that I'm an MP. I have 2 children, and I'm a business owner. I have 2 businesses. Right now, I am looking after my 15-year-old child, and my spouse is abroad, and yet I'm here. So earlier we talked about the 26 weeks. We talked about accessibility and why a double standard. Because we have a colleague, Madam Chair, who explained how much she was criticized because her child was accompanying her. I would like to hear what you have to say about this, because when my spouse is abroad and an MP, and when there's so many options, what type of image do we give with respect to this double standard? We can't confuse the role of a business owner and that of an MP. I'd like to hear from Equal Voice.
Thank you. I think that hybrid really, as has been said, everybody's here today, and yet if there was a circumstance where someone simply could not be here, you would still have the opportunity to be participating in this meeting, hearing from the witnesses, not missing anything. I think, as has been said by my colleagues here as well, it's something hybrid has been adopted very widely around the world, in the business world, in academia, and actually, I'm giving a guest lecture at Queen's University this afternoon, and I'm able to do that remotely because I'm here.
Je suis tout à fait d'accord, Madame la Présidente.
I agree, Madam Chair, but we have to talk about things as they are. I do most of my business meetings at night, but as a parliamentary, 26 weeks a week, we're talking about accommodation. My last question, Madam Chair, was if tomorrow morning women or fathers, when you think of everything that we need to do to make their role as an MP easier, 26 weeks, I remind you of that. Would it change things? Would it change hybrid? Because we all agree hybrid is possible. We don't say, I'll stay at the house just in case, or I'm sick. Mrs. Clark, what would you have to say to that? We don't have any time left. I am sorry.
Oh, Madame Blaney.
I'm fighting with the microphone. Sorry about that. I'm married to a politician as well. So I have a husband who is rarely home because of his political commitment. And one of the biggest challenges when our kids were still young enough that they needed caring for was trying to figure out how to balance that when I had to physically be away. And I also just want to add, and I think this is what I really would like to hear you talk about, is I represent a rural riding. It's the third largest in British Columbia, and really by standards, it's not that huge, but it's just under 60,000 square kilometers. So there are many times when I would come home for the weekend and I didn't get to be with my family because I was landing in a different community, doing all the work that I needed to do in that area, and then coming back. So I'm just wondering if you could speak to the reality of the benefits that it would mean for people if they had at least an opportunity to work virtually if there's a high need in their riding because they have a large riding, because right now we know that flights are getting harder and harder. Some of the ridings across this country, last session I was not able to go home very often. It's much better now, but there are things that happen that made it really hard for me to get home. So I was actually not as home as often because I couldn't fly until Saturday, would not get there till the afternoon, and had to leave first thing Sunday morning. So I'm just wondering if we could talk about the challenges that families experience because of this distance and how most of the time people are still here, but this allows for those moments in life where you just need to be there because your partner is on an emergency somewhere. I think, anyways, I don't have a lot of time left, and I'll start with Equal Voice.
Thank you. Yes, distance is a big issue for women considering running for office. We hear from many, many women who attend our trainings and campaign schools that they're choosing to run at the municipal or the provincial level because of the concerns about both the time, the time it takes to fly, but also how far they will be away from home if they're running federally. Obviously, that doesn't apply to everybody, but it is something that we repeatedly hear.
And I think this is really about just providing a little bit more choice. And I think that is a really important. Is there anything my time is up. Yeah.
Oui, je sais, mais je prends le temps pour tout le monde.
Yes, I realize that, but
flexibility. Again, as a mother and a business owner, my husband is also a business owner and the daughter of a pretty incredible mom that was a judge and a mother to 4 children. You want to be present in your professional life. And you want to also put in place concessions like babysitters and relying on family and your partner when at all possible. But there are those moments where it's not possible. And in those moments, we require this flexibility, and that's why I strongly support hybrid parliament.
Just so you do know, I keep time for everybody's round. So when somebody gets a little bit of extra time, and in the first round, Mrs. Blaney was done within 18 seconds of it. So I just let her have the generosity we gave everybody else now. So thank you. I really do want to say that was fun. It was really nice to have everyone here. Loved the exchange of questions, but our time has run out. And if there's anything else you want to add, you can always send it in writing to the clerk, because I know Madame Goudreau would like the answer to her question. If you want to contribute something, please just send us a note in writing. Thank you so much for your time today. Please keep well and keep safe. And we're going to suspend for a minute and head to the next panel. Thank you. Philippe Fournier, so joining us today is Philippe Fournier, Assistant Professor, Audiologist, Université Laval, by video conference. Bienvenue. Killian G. Sieber, Professor, University of Geneva, also by video conference. Welcome. And then we have Darren C. And Assistant Professor, Department of, I don't even know, or say that for me one time? There we go. And Head of Neck Surgery, University of Ottawa. So welcome. We will start with Professor Fournier. Please go ahead.
Members of the committee, it's a privilege to be able to testify today. My name is Philippe Fournier. I'm an assistant professor at the audiology faculty at University Laval. My research is to understand the impact of various disorders such as tinnitus, hyperkaluis, which is sensitivity to noise, and other symptoms, including plugged ears and painful ears. I have been doing my research in this field. I'm very interested in studying people who've experienced these symptoms. There's no clear consensus on what is meant by acoustic shock injury, such as tinnitus, but the appearance of symptoms can be immediate, or it can happen. It can last for a few days or a week, depending on and it varies from individual to individual. This was detected for the first time in call centers where people were bothered by acoustic shocks because of the headsets they were wearing. We don't know exactly why this happens, but I worked with the AIIC, the Association of Conference Interpreters and Translations Bureau, to study the system further as a result of the virtual and Zoom conferences during COVID. The origin of the problem is unknown, but I worked also with on a research project with the Bureau of Translation, and that was held by Professor Lagasse of the University of Ottawa. And I will answer to any questions that you may have to the best of my ability. Thank you.
Merci à vous.
Thank you.
Continuez.
We will continue with Mr. Tse.
Thank you, Madam Chair, honorable members, and thank you for your invitation to appear today as part of the study on hybrid proceedings. As mentioned, I'm an otolaryngologist and a neuro-otologist at the Ottawa Hospital, and assistant professor at the university. My clinical and research focuses are mainly on the inner ear and encompasses everything from hearing disorders to dizziness and balance disorders. I've been in practice for almost 10 years. Dr. Fournier stole some of my thunder, and you'll see on the list of references that I posted for you guys, his work with the AIIC is one of the references in the report from last year. Over the past 2 years, there's been widespread adoption of virtual meetings in all fields of life, and there's been some publications and media entries actually specifically about parliamentary interpreters suffering from something called acoustic shock injury. Now, ASI is not really being specifically defined, but it is described as a phenomenon occurring in people who do jobs requiring prolonged periods of concentrated hearing and attention, usually through headsets, and can be subjected to sudden and unexpected loud noise spikes. Examples of these occupations include air traffic control workers, military radio and communications operators, and call center operators, all of which I've had experience working with. Very similar symptoms occur in anybody exposed to prolonged periods of noise exposure, such as first responders, police, and industrial workers, and or intense but short duration noise spikes, such as people who use chainsaws, power tools, and firearms. In my practice, I would simply refer to these patients as having noise damage or acoustic trauma, and have not necessarily labeled them in the past as ASI. Most likely, this is a case of medical professionals in different fields labeling the same problem with different names. Examples of these loud noise spikes include feedback loops, sudden changes in volume, acoustic pops, tapping on the microphone, and other things happening around the speaker and the microphone. I'm sure we've all experienced this over the last few years. Many of us has likely encountered these sounds many times before. Symptoms of ASI can range from mild to severe, from temporary to chronic, and can include tinnitus, which is an intrusive or ringing noise in the ear, hyperacusis, which is sensitivity to noise, oral fullness, which is a feeling of plugging or pressure in the ear, like when you're on an airplane, and ear pain. More severe and chronic cases can have symptoms like headaches, nausea, dizziness, and balance dysfunction. It's recognized that ASI can also cause psychological distress, including sleep disorders, anxiety, and depressive symptoms. From what I've read in the media, there seems to be currently a not insignificant portion of parliamentary interpreters who are suffering with or off work due to symptoms of ASI right now. ASI was first coined, from what I can tell, in Australia in the early 2000s by audiologists. There was no clear real publication regarding ASI until Merriam-Westcott published in 2006. There's actually a large body of evidence on noise damage and its resulting short and long-term symptoms. There's long-standing legislation surrounding at-work exposure to loud noise levels, both at the federal and provincial levels. There are well-established mechanisms of compensation for on-the-job sufferers of noise injury through agencies like the WSIB. Despite all this, there's not really been much research on ASI specifically, especially in the literature outside of audiology. Most recently, as I mentioned, Dr. Philippe Fournier published a project that highlighted the high prevalence of ASI in interpreting staff around the world. And in fact, Canada ranked 13 out of 81 countries surveyed in terms of number of interpreters currently suffering with ASI, which is not great. This publication includes a call to action, steps for interpreting staff to safeguard against ASI, and call for further research. And to that end, I would recommend that the government send afflicted interpreters for full audiological, otologic, and psychological assessment and management.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing more from you during the question and answer round. And now we'll go to Professor Sieber. Welcome.
Madame la Présidente, merci.
Madam Chair, thank you to inviting me to this committee meeting and have an opportunity to discuss hybrid proceedings. Unfortunately, I can't be with you, but I am in a good position to understand what virtual interpretation constitutes, especially for interpreters who have to deal with this supplemental load.
I'm an associate professor at the Faculty of Translation and Interpreting here at the University of Geneva, and I've spent the last 15 years, give or take, trying to better understand the construct of cognitive load, especially cognitive load as it relates to simultaneous conference interpreting. So we do know that the human brain has an extraordinary capacity when it comes to the storage of long-term information to the tune of roughly 7 billion gigabytes. But when it comes to short-term storage, and particularly when it comes to attention or cognitive control, unfortunately, it is rather limited. So our working memory, which we believe to be the system that is responsible for short-term storage and manipulation of information, is finite. This is where three important notions come in, which I'd like to cover before I tell you about the empirical studies we just concluded. Cognitive capacity being the processing resources that can be deployed by the system. Cognitive load being the processing demands that are imposed on the system. And cognitive effort, the processing capacity that's actually allocated to a task. When imposed load exceeds capacity, or when the invested effort doesn't meet task demands, the process will slow down and eventually will break down. And interestingly, in cognitive terms, simultaneous interpreter training, rather than focusing on language training, aims at acquiring the skills required to strategically allocate resources to accommodate this increased task load. As I was saying before, we carried out some studies at the University of Geneva very recently, and we looked into the relationship between deteriorated sound and cognitive load in simultaneous interpreters. In the first study, we observed interpreters and their psychophysiological response in the field to what I would call frequently occurring salient triggers. So events that you'll run into time and again when you have online meetings or hybrid meetings, such as this one. And we saw that interpreters show significant psychophysiological responses. So it's their body that responds to instances of bad sound, including echoes, distortions, pops, clicks, or the background noises. In a second study, we then measured the interpreter's psychophysiological response to deteriorated sound. We artificially deteriorated the sound by reducing the frequency response and found that interpreters showed significant cognitive and emotional response during low quality sound, that there was a significant increase in the subjective load that they perceived during low quality sound, that load sets in, this increased load sets in as early as after the first 10 minutes on task. The experiment was designed in a way where they would be on task for 10 minutes, off for 15, on for 10, and that in an iteration of 4 times. Interpretation quality, importantly, decreases significantly with low quality sound. And of the 3 parameters analyzed, it was not style, not presentation, but content that suffered significantly. And in the third study, we then measured cognitive load as it changes with artificially deteriorated sound, again, reduced frequency response. And we found that cognitive load, and we measured it with pupil dilation, so again, psychophysiologically, didn't significantly change when interpreters just had to listen to that sound, but the cognitive load did significantly increase when they interpreted.
Thank you.
So taken together.
Thank you for those introductory comments, Professor. We look forward to hearing more from you during the question and answer round. We will now go starting with our 6-minute rounds. Mr. Culkins, followed by Mr. Fergus. Mr. Culkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Tsay, would you like to finish your thoughts, please?
Yeah, sorry, I timed myself, but I guess I spoke a bit slower in the room. As I mentioned, that much research does need to be done, especially in this setting of interpreters. As I mentioned, I've treated patients in other fields who suffer with similar symptoms. But I was just talking to one of the interpreters outside before I came in, and I've never met a single interpreter in 10 years of work, and neither has any of my colleagues who also ear specialists at the hospital. So it's a little bit interesting. Certainly lots of research needs to be done, and I think it would only be comprehensive if it involved specialists like myself, audiologists with an interest like Dr. Fournier, and cognitive specialists as well, because that's a big part of it. We see a corollary in these kind of symptoms in the dizziness world, where patients are exposed to certain noxious stimuli and end up having chronic dizziness from that. And many of the symptoms in ASI are very similar, just the trigger was an acoustic injury. So there's probably a lot of cross-learning available on that side as well.
So using the precautionary principle, should Canadian Parliament continue the use of hybrid parliament? It's one thing to institute this while you're dealing with a pandemic, but if you're not dealing with a pandemic, this appears to me to be at least making life easier for MPs, which is a debate that we will have with the public. But in the interests of the health and safety of our interpretive staff, who in a bilingual country we depend on immensely, should we, using the precautionary principle, proceed with hybrid? In your opinion, should we proceed with hybrid parliament without actually having these studies done first, or would you suggest that we actually get some of the evidence before we proceed with continuing with virtual or hybrid parliament?
I think it's well shown that there's harm, and so I don't think there's too much point in waiting and causing more harm while we're doing studies. The studies won't happen overnight. And if there's no convincing reason, say COVID-wise, to continue with hybrid meetings, then I see no reason to continue to expose people to harm. Saying that, they are still exposed to harm from interpreting just as they are now. It's just that virtual meetings and the technology to do that very well had to catch up very quickly over the last 2 years. And so they will still be exposed to such harm to a lesser degree, even with in-person meetings, and that's shown by evidence going way back long before COVID was a problem. But you can try and minimize the that exposure as much as possible.
So I'm looking for an opinion, and any of the three witnesses, feel free to chime in on this if you choose to. Prior to COVID, committees such as this would offer video conferencing for guests, but it was not over Zoom. It was not over the person's individual internet connection. They would have to go to a place that actually offered that video conferencing capability. And now what we're talking about, or what's being proposed, is continuing on with the Zoom version, not the pre-COVID video conferencing version where we had much better access. People would only have video conferencing in places where you had high-speed access, for example. So would your recommendation be that it would be okay to return to that style of video conferencing because we didn't have those problems. We never heard of these types of hearing injuries or problems in that particular style. So would you say, I would argue that the technology, even though it's caught up and gone a long ways, has still not caught up to where we were with the pre-COVID video conferencing. Does anybody want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, the technology is definitely one part of the exposure problem, but any kind of over-ear, in-ear, noise pops, which does happen in any kind of, remote conferencing, can still expose, as we see by people who do those other occupations that I mentioned. And I know we haven't heard of it here. That does not mean it was not happening and not recognized.
Mr. Fournier, Dr. Fournier.
Oui, je voulais ajouter que...
I'd like to add that there are several factors involved. There's the technology, but there's the environmental factors. We have to try and control the sound. Now I'm in my home. I'd like to have been there, but I just found out about this meeting today. So we are limited when we're at home. Somebody just earlier, for example, there was someone gardening with a leaf blower just outside my window. So there are environmental factors at play here as well, aside from the technological factors. When you have a specific space and you have a silent place where you know that you'll not be exposed to sudden surges, that is helpful.
Comments on this?
Sure, very briefly. I think one factor that needs to be considered is one of volume and frequency. We know from surveys that were carried out among AIC members, for example, so members of the International Association of Conference Interpreters, that the frequency at which they would be asked to interpret remotely or also in hybrid settings was extremely low. It was proportionally higher in a country like Canada, where particularly over-the-phone interpreting was more widely spread, which was actually the genesis of one of our experiments. So to add to that, as soon as you can control the environment, I think you can control some of the factors that are of negative impact to both the psyche and the hearing.
Thank you, Professor. We will now go on to Mr. Fergus, up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would like to thank all of our witnesses who are here today. I find that this is an excellent panel, and you have really given us some good food for thought. You all mentioned that this problem existed before the hybrid format of Parliament. It's a problem that anybody could have suffered from, including our interpreters who do an exceptionally difficult but necessary job here in Parliament. Just by wearing headsets, regardless of whether you're talking about a session where everyone's present or where it's a hybrid format, the cognitive impacts, well, you've all alluded to those. The question I have, I would imagine that you're not suggesting that we stop offering simultaneous interpretation for Parliament, but when people are present. But what should we be doing in order to reduce, to the extent possible, the impact for our interpreters who have to listen to us. They must not only listen to us, but they have to translate in their heads at the same time. What should we be doing to minimize the impact on their ears, which is their tool of work? And we could begin with Professor Fournier, and then we can turn to Professor Sieber and conclude with Dr. C. I think the first thing that you need to do is to listen to them. When interpreters report that they have symptoms, they're the ones who are in the best situation to describe their symptoms. I would say that you should listen to what the interpreters are saying when they report symptoms. That's the first thing that needs to be done. Secondly, I think that adaptations that can be made, as my colleague was saying, and we need to do more research on this. There are perhaps some adaptations that can be made in terms of time of work, environment. These things can all be done. But once again, we need to do more research to understand really what the problem is. I don't think there's no miracle solution. I don't think technology is going to resolve everything. I think that we have to try to understand what are the factors involved that generate this type of symptom and adapt to the situation so that the interpreters no longer experience these symptoms. That's my answer. I don't know if I've answered your question. Yes, that helps me. Professor Sieber, thank you for your question. I fully agree. We need to do more research on this. Our experiments on frequencies has been helpful, but that's just a little part of the whole situation. We know relatively little about this. So if we can have more information so that we can then adapt the software and the hardware and that ensures better communications, I think that's the best solution. But since people have been driving cars, well, they're not able to control everything. Same thing for the sound. We have to reduce perhaps the time that the interpreters are exposed to these parameters. And Dr. C.
I'm going to point to the other side of the equation, which is what happens after they already have symptoms. And from what I can tell, these patients don't really get referred to see us. And after speaking to interpreters outside in the hallway here before I came in, they're having a lot of trouble having their symptoms recognized for what they are, getting the appropriate treatment and referrals, and getting compensation like other workers would do through WSIB or similar agencies. They've not been able, because they can't get recognized that they have this problem, they cannot then go further with trying to help improve their quality of life and get back to work. So I think that's the other side of the problem is we got to recognize that this is happening and help these people after they've already suffered symptoms.
Alors, très rapidement, parce qu'il m'en reste.
Very quickly, I don't have much time. I'd like to ask you all, maybe you can give me a very brief answer. It seems to me that you're telling us that, yes, the work is necessary. Yes, there are consequences to it, and I would imagine that what you're looking for really is that we adapt the situation to minimize the impact, but we can't eliminate this completely. Have I understood you correctly? To answer quickly, the answer, should it continue or not, I think that's your decision at the committee. There are lots of variables connected to democracy and other issues as well. If we continue to move forward, we're going to have to adapt better to minimize risk for interpreters. That's my brief answer. Can we get a brief answer from the others?
We'll definitely welcome them after.
Can I ask the other two witnesses if they're...
Jusqu'à 6 minutes.
I will continue with Ms. Goudreau, 6 minutes. Thank you, Madam Chair. We'll have the time because I sympathize for the interpreters, my colleagues, my interpreters. The witnesses spoke slowly, which was good, but I tend to speak quickly. But I am sitting here alarmed because there are aspects that make me wonder, how are we going to come up with some type of winning formula considering what you've said? You said that we have to reduce the exposure time of interpreters. Where are the interpreters? Where are the people coming in behind them? Where are their replacements? We don't have a full slate of interpreters right now because of a lack of human resources. How are we going to manage this? You've answered our questions, but it really does touch me a great deal. I would also like to ask you the following question. When we talk about the inadequate sound quality, you know, Madam Chair, as I do, that if there is an MP doesn't stand, if the interpreter doesn't step in and say it's inaudible, we continue working. So it's often we have an issue with interpretation because, particularly for francophones, so that is an issue. And I would like to know if there's another way that we could have the good practices to ensure at least that we stop using the tool. We don't have any control over our environment. I don't know if you have an opinion on that. Do you know of any means we could use to help interpreters avoid having acoustic shock when we're not working under very effective circumstances? Do you have any suggestions?
Si je peux me permettre.
If I may, Madam Chair, I think it's difficult if we don't know all of the factors. If on the one side we're saying, well, it's technology and we can't control the internet. If I have high-speed internet, maybe the person I'm speaking to doesn't have it. I can't control that. But what about human resources? Interpreters, as MPs, continue to work despite the fact that they have an additional cognitive load. That's why we find the interpreters winding up with medical problems. But unfortunately, I can't suggest a solution to you because I don't know all of the factors that would come into play. That's important to me, Madam Chair, to mention this. We want to do our job properly, but we're limited in our capacity. Does anybody else want to step in?
I guess my comment, I don't really know the best solution for the problem. However, I will point out for manpower issues, part of the issue is that these people are off work and not getting treatment and can't get back to work. And probably, like people in most lines of work, they want to work, but they cannot tolerate the conditions and the symptoms that working would result in. And so if we can recognize the problem and get patients the right treatment and get them back to work, that would go some way to solving manpower issues, for sure.
Ça me touche beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We see that there's a lack of, we don't acknowledge the symptoms and the problems, and given that we're going to be getting the official report on work accidents, we should be getting it soon. So I see a direct correlation with the tools that we had that my colleague referred to, which lead to other concerns. But there's a direct linkage with the use using different bandwidth, different software. What I am understanding, and I'd like to hear what you have to say. Do you agree with me that we have to be extremely vigilant on the the Parliament decides to continue with the hybrid proceedings because we don't control our environment.
Je vais commencer. Oui, mais je crois.
I think you have to be very vigilant and careful because there's a risk for the interpreters. Thank you. I think the challenge is that there are examples of workers from other organizations that came up with a formula that works. We have to use various factors, perhaps reducing the time worked by enabling a passive hybrid participation. That's because this is no longer the interpreters who will have to deal with this issue. But obviously, that has repercussions on other political issues. Yes, it impacts inclusion that we referred to earlier.
Peut-être la prochaine fois.
Maybe the next time. So we must continue now with 6 minutes. Could we, if there are any aspects that we would like to have, if they could send it in. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it and really appreciate the testimony that we're hearing today. If I could start with you first, Professor Sieber. I guess one of the things that would be helpful just for clarification is if you could talk about the difference between the cognitive capacity load effort as opposed to what it means to talk about acoustic shock, just so that the members, I just need clarity on what the difference is.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, if you want to find out more about acoustic shock, I think you're best advised talking to my colleagues who are experts in the field. I am not a medical expert. I can tell you that from the literature I have read, I am unaware of any direct link between.
Okay, that's fine. I'll ask you a question you can answer then. I apologize for that. So you talked about cognitive load. So I'm just wondering if you could talk to us about what is specific to this around interpreting from remote participation as opposed to seeing person right across from you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. We're still in the process of finding out what the factors are that do change. What certainly does change more often than not is the makeup of the sound signal. And I'm deliberately not calling it quality of sound because that's a laden term in itself. But there might be other factors as well, factors including visual input, factors including the necessary multitasking that increases tremendously when you have to interact with a platform setup such as the one I'm using right now. And I have to process at the same time signal sources in different modalities that come in at me, which they usually do not. Some of this might be a matter of training, but I am afraid to say that the human brain most likely did not make as great a stride as technology did over the past few years.
So what safeguards should be put in place to protect interpreters from the problems associated with audio from remote participation?
Is this a question to me?
Yes, it is.
Madam Chair? I'm not sure I'm best placed to talk about the safeguards in terms of their potential health issues, because the link between cognitive load and potentially cognitive overload and the resulting health issues is still underexplored. Now, obviously, there's some things that we know it is not a good thing for you to be overexposed to overload for an extended period of time. And this is the kind of overload that you would experience if you encounter such parameters, such detrimented sound or deteriorated sound for an extended period of time. Again, for right now, my only and perhaps trivial answer is reducing time on task because we do not know a whole lot more, and there are certain parameters that we can't act upon.
Thank you so much for that. If I could go now to Professor Fournier. You said earlier, adapt better. If you could explain what that means, that would be helpful.
Oui.
Once again, we don't know exactly what happens. What's the cause of this? Is it the volume? Is it the exposure to loud sounds or sound spikes or noise spikes? it's difficult to say, oh, we'll reduce all that. We can adapt. Interpreters can adapt, but we don't know exactly what the causes are. So we're basing ourselves on what the interpreters are reporting to us. What generates the most symptoms? We could perhaps reduce time spent in booth. I don't know if that's a miracle solution or the best solution, but with the data that we currently have, that could be one type of adaptation to ensure that the interpreters have fewer symptoms based on what they're reporting. But once again, as we said earlier, we need to do more research to really understand what is occurring. I know interpreters can put on noise limiters to ensure that they control the level of noise going through their headset, but interpreters tend to raise the volume because they have to work, and interpreting is not the same as simply listening passively. When you're interpreting, you tend to put the volume up when you're interpreting than when you're, as opposed to when you're simply listening passively. So there are some ways that we would be able to adapt, but I do believe we need more research so we're sure we're doing the right thing.
You keep referencing research, which I think is really important. And I know that we have a report from the NRC, and then we have a report that this committee is still waiting to see from the House of Commons administration on the AV system. With respect to that, do you have any comments about those two reports and what their impact is and what the difference is around translation provided in person versus virtual participation?
I haven't had the opportunity to read these reports. I was in a meeting with the NRC at the very start when they started establishing their protocols, but I haven't really read the report, so I can't comment on it. Unfortunately, haven't received it yet, so I can't really comment on that. But I think that all of the research initiatives, it's good. There are multiple factors involved. It's relevant so that it'll enable us to understand the problem in its entirety. Thank you very much. Thank you for your answer. We will now continue with 5 minutes, Mr. Bitos, and 5 minutes for Mr. Henley.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would like to thank the interpreters who are interpreting these proceedings. Thank you very much for the work you do. I know that the QP is a nightmarish time for interpreters because people are speaking so quickly. And at least with this meeting, I am much more aware of what's involved. And I have a very important question, and I'd like to have a brief answer from each of you. Do you feel that the desire to make the life easier for MP justifies maintaining a dangerous workplace for interpreters until we have the results from studies that explain what we can do to reduce damaging their health? Mr. Tsay, Mr. Fournier, and Mr. Sieber.
As I mentioned earlier, I think you can minimize harm as soon as possible and still carry out research. And in my line of work, if it's a matter of convenience versus harm, I always pick no harm with a little bit of extra inconvenience. So, yeah, I think that's a pretty easy decision, to be honest.
Monsieur Fournier.
Mr. Fournier, I fully agree with my colleague. You have to take precautions.
Je suis tout à fait d'accord.
I fully agree. It's part and parcel of my experience from an ethical point of view. What I'm realizing is that every day we realize that each interpretation is more difficult when people are on Zoom. And the damage and the harm has been caused by poor sound feed because of the environment. I must admit that last week I was at a conference, not in the House of Commons, but I gave a conference while workers were on the roof, while repairing the roof with hammers going. I never realized until then how much damage could be done to someone who's trying to interpreting. We simply don't understand it, so we do have to take care. I think you have really got your message across today about this, and I think I'm going to go and speak to a few interpreters after this meeting to understand what they are experiencing given this current situation. I'd like to ask you, so that people understand correctly, what's the main difference between interpretation by Zoom or over Zoom and interpretation when the interpreters can have a direct contact with the people they are interpreting? Mr. Seaborn, you're a specialist in interpretation. Perhaps you could answer. Thank you very much. There are a lot of factors that change and factors that are quite clear and visible to everyone. When people are in the room, we can see things directly. Zoom tires us. It's the reality. It makes you tired. Any virtual interface is difficult for the communicator. And Zoom is not meant for interpreters. When interpreters are assigned to meetings, all of the work has to be transferred so that they can work digitally. There are other signals that you hear in the same room. The fact that you're no longer able to use your vision, because sometimes I can't see the person speaking. So sometimes I'm dealing with 20 people speaking, talking heads who are before me, and that's a potential source of fatigue as well that's engendered. So there's a long list of things involved. Not all factors have been explored to date or tested, but we do know that there is a very long potential list of factors. So we're talking about a completely different environment here.
Merci.
Thank you. One final question. Interpretation in Parliament is used primarily. It's usually English to French. Given the circumstances that you've just described, you talked about the fact that the short-term memory was affected. Do you think that the value or the content is affected more for people who are listening interpretation towards French? That's a very good question, but we don't have enough time to hear the answer. But he did nod yes.
Mr. Henley, jusqu'à 5 minutes.
Mr. Henley, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses for the really interesting testimony. Really important to hear, to listen, and to understand. And I want to second Monsieur Berthold for his thanking the interpreters for all the hard work that they do. Hearing deficits are definitely preventable, and at times we're certainly unaware of the effect of noise on our hearing. But I wish the precautionary principle could be applied so simply in any setting. There are harms and there are harms. And after listening to our witnesses from the first hour, do we really think that there would be no harms associated with scaling back from hybrid to in-person Parliament only? So the simple solution may be to recoil from uncertainty and lack of data, but the more complex solution may be to better understand the issue so we can go forward. So in that context, I have a few questions. Monsieur Fournier, je crois que vous avez dit que...
Mr. Fournier, I believe that you said that there's a lack of consensus about the prevalence of acoustic imagery. Did I hear you say that correctly? There's a lack of consensus on the definition of what constitutes an ASI. So not everyone recognizes acoustic shock, and my colleague earlier said that we use different terminology. So there's no consensus as to the definition of the term acoustic shock. Thank you.
To try to understand the scale and the scope of acoustic injury, and I recognize this is an emerging field, but Dr. C, I think you already answered to some degree, but you bring up the important point that symptoms may be varied and also under-recognized, but nevertheless you mentioned that you have not seen in 10 years of practice an interpreter with auditory problems. Is that correct?
Yes, I've seen people who work in air traffic control, obviously military radio, and people in all lines of work exposed to industrial noise, armed forces, police officers, things like that. But I've never seen a single person who works in interpretation.
Thank you. In your study that ranked Canada, the study that you cited that ranked Canada as 13 out of 81 countries, can you briefly elaborate? I may not have caught that all, and can you just also reflect on whether this reflected the adoption rate in Canada of virtual technology? In other words, was that number adjusted for the denominator, or does it speak to the amount of usage in Canada?
I'll actually refer that to Philippe Fournier because that was his study. So,
Monsieur Fournier, oui.
Mr. Fournier, your question is to know whether we adjusted to the number of interpreters in Canada? Yes. So the study was an online questionnaire that was created by AIC, and it was for people who worked in Parliament, who worked freelance. It was a specific study for interpreters. People were able to answer the survey freely. I don't think that all of the interpreters in Canada responded to the survey, but all AIC members did respond. And if I may, there is no longer any reason why interpreters will consult, and this is mentioned in the report. We talked about not being taken seriously when there are clinical tests, and when standard tests are done, we don't find any abnormalities. We don't see that with the audio tests. So I'm talking about the clinical tests. So interpreters sometimes feel like they're not being taken seriously. I have not much time.
I think we really want to protect our interpreters and make sure they have access to appropriate technology, and that acoustic etiquette, as I might call it, is observed. So regardless of whether Parliament maintains hybrid or not, we will always be using translators for a variety of functions, including the various settings and meetings that we have. If I'm understanding this correctly, it's not an issue of whether we should or should not do hybrid based on concerns about the well-being of interpreters, but that would be a bit like saying air traffic controllers should perhaps, if they're susceptible to air shock, should stop managing air traffic and get outside and wave their arms around. So I think it's more about identifying and understanding a hazard that we must recognize, address, and prevent. Thank you.
Mr. Henley, great first appearance at PROC. Thank you. I will put it over now to Madame Gaudreau.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I must observe that if we had the technology, if we had greater availability of human resources, I think that we would have a consensus here around the table with what we've received, the information we've received regarding interpretation concerns and the reduction of our human resources availability. So there's some choices that we're going to have to make, and they're political choices. I'm eager to see the results of this. I'm eager to see the documents that will be tabled. But just to make sure, because after I'd like to ask the team and the witness to continue his speech, because he hadn't touched on third. Dr. C, did I understand you correctly that you have not before you have never had any interpreters as patients, but now you have them as patients? Is that correct?
So yeah, I've never seen a single interpreter as a patient, and I still have not to this day. Although I understand the nice lady who spoke to me outside is going to be contacting my office.
Okay.
Okay, that being said, it's and your colleagues, have your colleagues, you are a rare resource to have your colleagues, I would imagine, given the concerns expressed about acoustic shock, have your colleagues, in fact, had any interpreters as patients?
So before today, I did speak to one of my colleagues who's also a neuro-otologist at the hospital, and we're the only two at the hospital there, and he has never heard of this problem before.
Bon.
As it's known as ASI. Obviously, as I mentioned, we've treated noise damage in the past, but.
And for the time that's left, I would like to, Madam Chair, I believe that you have already written a text, and it has to be translated into both languages before we can receive it. I'm convinced that there are some aspects that have not been covered. No, I don't have any time left. So I would appreciate that you provide all the information in both languages. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and I really appreciate the testimony today, and more importantly, I really, really appreciate the incredible work that the interpreters do in this House. They are so kind, and they do such a great job of making our voices understandable to people who speak a different language. So I'm one of the official languages. So I'm always grateful to them, and personally, they've always been very, very good to me. So I think we have to take what we're hearing today really seriously, and I hope that I know I've had many conversations with interpreters, and I hope today that we do really make sure that our recommendations clearly support what interpreters need to do their work as effectively as they do it now. So I guess I just have one last question for Professor Sieber. I'm coming back to you again because I'm still trying to wrap my head around this cognitive load. And I'm just wondering if you could talk about what you've seen from your own experience. How has it become more of a widespread issue or something more impactful because of the pandemic? Is there a direct correlation to this? And what can you tell us about that? Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would bring that back to the studies that we've run and the results that we have gathered, rather than anecdotal evidence that I might have seen in walking about interpreting booths and behind the scenes. The results, and I think that there's one result that should concern everybody who sits in the room and who listens to interpretation, is one whereby deteriorated sound quality leads not necessarily to something that sounds off, not necessarily something that is off stylistically, but something that is missing important or not important content. And so when we do not know, as people sitting in the room relying on interpretation, whether the interpreter is actually able to provide all of the content, then I think I would leave that in the hands of people who do research into politics and other fields to see whether that is something you would deem appropriate or acceptable. So that, I think, is one of the big obvious dangers for the people in the room. For the people in the booths, I think we still need to find out more about the extent to which increased and sustained cognitive load/overload might lead to medical manifestations, to physiological manifestations. But we do not have at this stage any real long-term study. So we don't have any longitudinal study, and the studies we've done, even ours, only had exposure on task 14 minutes with 15 minutes break in between after every 10 minutes, which is far less than the average interpreter has to do in a working day.
Thank you so much for that answer. I do want to just, on behalf of PROC committee members, thank the witnesses who have joined us with the extent of information that you have shared. I will just note that Mr. Fergus et Madame Gaudreau et Mr. Berthold ont demandé des questions.
Mr. Berthold, Mr. Fergus, and Ms. Goudreau have asked for written answers. That would be, please forward any answers to the clerk. Thank you very much.
Next Tuesday for PROC again. Thank you. Keep well and safe, everyone.
Merci beaucoup à vous.
Merci.